China has the longest continuous tradition of applying the dialectical method to socioeconomic analysis. The school of yin and yang emerged in the 3rd century BC, and the dialectical method has remained central to China's philosophy ever since. In the West, the two most profound analyses of capitalism's contradictory character are those of Adam Smith and Karl Marx. For each of them, the two-edged sword is the essence of capitalism. Since its early appearance in the ancient world, capitalist competition has produced immense benefits, but also profound problems. In the recent era of capitalist globalization, the benefits have reached new heights, but the dangers have reached new depths, which threaten the very survival of the human species. First of all, a little bit about capitalist rationality. Since ancient times, in both the East and the West, the exercise of individual freedom has been inseparable from the expansion of the market, driven by the search for profit. This force, namely capitalism, has stimulated human creativity and aggression in ways that have produced immense benefits. In the era of globalization, since the 1980s, these have greatly broadened in scope, and these benefits have become even greater. Market competition and innovation in China before the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith's famous metaphor of the invisible hand captured vividly the rationality of the competitive market economy. The invisible hand not only stimulates efficiency through gains from specialization and exchange, but also stimulates technical progress. Smith was equally explicit about the necessary role of the visible hand of government, where markets fail. And he said, in a very careful passage, the third and last duty of the government is that of erecting and maintaining those public institutions and those public works which, though they may be in the highest degree advantageous to a great society, are, however, of such a nature that the profit could never repay the expense to any individual or small number of individuals, and which it therefore cannot be expected that any individual or small number of individuals should erect or maintain. The performance of this duty of the government, of the state, is very different in different eras of society and by implication in different countries. China's long history of technical progress, from the Han Dynasty up until the early 19th century, resulted from a positive symbiotic relationship between the invisible hand of market competition and the visible hand of state action. The concept, as we all know, of a meritocratic bureaucracy emerged under the Han Dynasty and developed its classical form under the Tang. Exams for entry to and promotion within the bureaucracy focused on the Confucian classics and Chinese history. The system emphasized pragmatism, problem solving, practical problems in order to ensure the well-being of the mass of the population. Because it was a system with ethics at its core, it was widely accepted as legitimate. The Chinese bureaucracy performed crucial functions to ensure that the market economy and competition could prosper. These include maintaining peace across the vast territory, allowing specialization and exchange, constructing and maintaining a huge system of water control, avoiding famines, and then resolving famines if they did happen, printing and supporting the production of encyclopedias in order to spread knowledge, administering a legal system that protected property rights for producers and traders, and ensuring from the ancient world that commodity prices, if at all possible, were kept stable. The traditional Chinese economy developed a high level of urbanization. China's internal trade was much greater than that of Europe. There was also a flourishing trade across the South China Sea. The vibrant market economy sustained long-term technical progress, driven mainly by competition between firms. For around 2,000 years prior to the 18th century, China was by far the most important center of world technological progress. Its long history of unity, stability, and intelligent state action produced this remarkable development of technologies that contributed fundamentally to Europe's post-Renaissance technical progress. And now we turn to market competition and innovation in the West since the Industrial Revolution. After 1800, the British Industrial Revolution, of course, transformed the world. Since then, global innovation has been dominated by firms from high-income countries. Since the 1980s, the acceleration of technical progress has brought to a new high point the process analyzed by Marx in the Communist Manifesto. And he said, and it's the following: the bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive, more colossal productive forces than have all the preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, transportation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing whole continents for cultivation, the canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? And a fortiori, that is the case today in capitalist globalization. In each industrial sector today, a small group of so-called systems integrator firms occupy the commanding heights, accounting for half or more of the total global market. Pressure from these giant firms cascades across the supply chain, forcing consolidation deep down into the supply chain. Technical progress has been driven by ferocious oligopolistic competition between these giant systems integrator firms as well as the leading firms and their supply chains. If we look at the world's top 2,500 companies in terms of development, research and development expenditure, they spend 2 years ago nearly $800 billion on research and development. The top 500 companies within that group account for 82% of the total. In other words, a group of only around 500 companies is the core of global innovation and progress in the early 21st century. Capitalism and the expansion of human freedom. First of all, freedom from the tyranny of nature, which we take for granted. Technical progress is so rapid that at $70 a barrel, the supply of oil and gas is to all intents and purposes infinite. Market forces have helped to stimulate a tremendous reduction in the amount of primary energy needed to produce a unit of final product. Oligopolistic competition between giant automobile, truck, train, aeroplane and ship makers has produced rapid technical progress, incredible technical progress, resulting in a dramatic decline in the cost of transporting both people and goods around the world. Oligopolistic competition amongst giant IT firms has produced a revolution in telecommunications with revolutionary advances in functionality and a continuous, incredible fall in the real price of telecommunications. Freedom from poverty. The population of developing countries increased from 3.6 billion in 1980 to over 6.2 billion in 2015 in developing countries. Nevertheless, despite this huge increase in population, the proportion of the world's population living on less than $1.90 per day fell from 35% in 1990 to 11% in 2013. In low-income countries, average life expectancy at birth, the most important indicator of welfare, rose from 50 years to 62 years between 1990 and 2015, and in lower middle-income countries, the increase was from 60 to 68 years. This was made possible by technical progress in medical equipment, medicines, in food production, and in technologies to spread knowledge through information technology, as well as advances in transport system to distribute food better, and in food processing technologies to reduce waste. Freedom from inequality. Since the 1980s, GDP growth in developing countries has greatly exceeded that in developing countries. As a result of this difference in growth, with faster growth in developing countries, there has been a significant fall in the global Gini coefficient of income distribution from 72 in 1988 to 67 in 2011. The so-called global median class with incomes between $2 and $16 per day increased from 23% of the global population in 1988 to 40% in 2011. A cosmopolitan world. The interconnected cosmopolitan world of this era has advanced dramatically, and this is consistent with Marx's own view of the progressive character of capitalist globalization in the Communist Manifesto. The need of a constantly expanding market for its production chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. In place of the old local and national self-seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. As in material, so in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. He could be writing about the world today. And during this era, we have seen the beginnings of the creation of a common culture. And indeed, in the year 2008, of course, the Olympic Games took place in Beijing, and the famous slogan of those games was, of course, "One world, one dream." It is hard to imagine that such a world could experience a major international conflict. However, there are deep aspects of irrationality in this system, the other side of the two-edged sword, 双刃剑. In the era of capitalist globalization, these contradictions have intensified. So human beings have taken their capabilities to new heights to free themselves from all kinds of constraints, but reached new depths in terms of the uncontrollability of the whole global system of political economy. And again, I turn to Marx for his extraordinary prescient comments in the Communist Manifesto. Modern bourgeois society, he said, with its relations to production and exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the nether world. Oh, this is quite unreasonable. The theme of my talk can be captured by a phrase that people use more and more over the last decade. And that is the opening lines of Charles Dickens' The Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. In the interest of time, which unfortunately have been imposed, the next part of my talk is about three issues. It is about the environment and about the destruction of our environment, which I will not have time to talk about. It's about the extraordinary concentration of global business power in the hands of a very small group of firms which have their headquarters in high-income countries. Thirdly, about global inequality. Although global inequality has declined in terms of income and the Gini coefficient, the distribution of global wealth remains unbelievably unequal after 30 years of capitalist globalization. The top 1% have 50%, the bottom 50% have 1%. It's an unbelievable reflection on the injustice of this extraordinary era in which we live. And in both rich and poor countries, there are powerful processes at work that have led to increased inequality within both groups of countries. The final point I want to talk about before my conclusion is the global financial system. In this country, there's a great deal of discussion, quite rightly, about the relationship between finance and the real economy. And if you try to understand this extraordinarily complex but fundamental question, nowhere is that explored more deeply and more interestingly than in Karl Marx and in Volume 3 of Das Kapital. And he argued for the central role of finance in creating instability, disturbances, and deep suffering for people because of the cycles in the capitalist system with the financial system at its core. And during this era in the high-income countries, the concentration of economic power in the hands of a very small group of immensely capable global financial firms has led to the deregulation of global financial markets in the West, and that is still the case. And most serious people really believe that there is going to be another financial crisis in the West, if not this year, then next year, if not next year, the year after. It's a deep, deep contradiction still unresolved in capitalism. So finally, I'll turn to my concluding comments. Modern capitalist globalization began in the late 1970s. As the wild animal of capitalist globalization became ever more powerful, it became increasingly important that human beings establish a moral framework to regulate its activity and prevent the wild animal from devouring its creator, humanity. In order to resolve the contradictions of capitalist globalization, there is no other choice than to grope our way as a species towards international cooperation. The way in which people choose collectively to exercise that intelligence is governed by their ethics. We can say ethics, as Adam Smith said, are the pole star to guide humanity on its journey through history. Indeed, Smith, while he was brutally realistic about the elemental power of market forces to stimulate through competition progress, also argued that a good society was a very different kind of society. Indeed, he said, at the core of that good society was benevolence. To feel much for others, said Adam Smith, and little for ourselves, is to restrain our selfish and indulge our benevolent affections constitutes the perfection of human nature and can alone amongst mankind produce that harmony of sentiments and passions in which consists their whole grace and propriety, benevolence at the core. Moreover, for Smith, which is of great relevance to this meeting, argued that benevolence doesn't stop at your own doorstep, your own community, or your own nation. The wise and virtuous man, he said, at all times is willing that his own private interest should be sacrificed to the public interest of his own particular order or society. He is at all times willing, too, that the interest of this order or society should be sacrificed to the greater interest of the state or the sovereignty, of which it is only a subordinate part. He should therefore be equally willing that all those inferior interests of his own society, even his country, should be sacrificed to the greater interest of the universe, to that great interest of the great society of all sensible and intelligent beings, which God himself is the immediate administrator and director of. He must consider all the misfortunes which may befall himself, his friends, his society, or his country as necessary for the prosperity of the universe. And that, of course, is the philosophy of 世界大同, which is there deeply embedded in Adam Smith. So, global regulation of the wild animal of capitalist competition in the common interest of all under heaven, if you like, 天下为公, requires benevolence, 仁, across different cultures and countries at different levels of development and with different national interests. The very depth of the challenges that human beings now face, Darwinian challenges, may shock them into the action necessary to ensure the survival of our species. Alongside humans' competitive and destructive instincts are their Darwinian instincts for species survival through benevolence and cooperation. The approach of the final hour, as humanity looks into the abyss, may be the final impulse to produce the cooperative solution that is imminent in the unfolding of global capitalism. As Hegel said, the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. Indeed, we might say that global cooperative solutions, in a sense, constitute the essence of communism in the 21st century. In this sense, we might say communism is a choice of no choice, for the whole human species' survival. Finally, the relationship between China and the West is centrally important in humanity's attempt to grope a way forward in this extraordinarily dangerous time. China is trying to learn from the past, regulating the market. 古为今用. At the core of this philosophy is a dynamic balance between the forces of yin and yang in order to find the middle way, so-called 中庸, in a positive sum fashion. It has the potential to make a rich contribution to resolving the contradictions of the two-edged sword, the 双刃剑, of capitalist globalization. Over the course of 2,000 years, China accumulated rich experience in integrating the dynamic force of the invisible hand of the market, competition with pragmatic, non-ideological regulation of the market through the visible hand of the government, in order to serve the interests of the mass of the population. This philosophy can make an invaluable contribution to the establishment of a harmonious, ethically guided global global political economy, which resolves incrementally the contradictions of capitalist globalization in the interests of the whole human species. This is a form of groping for stones to cross the river, 摸着石头过河, in the famous phrase of China's reform. For the whole of humanity, all together we are groping in order to reach the other bank, 彼岸. And the other bank is a world in which all the world's inhabitants will live in peace and security with equal access to the means for self-fulfillment. Thank you.